The eviction notice came on a Tuesday morning in November, taped to the door of the apartment Daniel Carter had been paying for with construction work that had dried up 3 months ago. 72 hours to vacate, the paper said in language designed to strip dignity from desperation. His 7-year-old son Lucas stood beside him reading words he shouldn't have had to understand at his age, his small hand finding Daniel's with the instinct children develop when stability becomes uncertain. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Daniel had $450 in his checking account, everything he'd managed to save from the final construction job before the contractor went bankrupt, owing him $2,000 in back wages. His truck needed brake work he couldn't afford, his phone was one payment from disconnection, and Lucas needed winter clothes that last year's wouldn't fit. The eviction wasn't surprising. He'd been late on rent twice, had negotiated extensions that bought time but not solutions. What surprised him was how little fight he had left, how the constant grind of barely surviving had worn him down to simple acceptance that sometimes you lost no matter how hard you tried. Lucas's mother had left when their son was 3, had walked out one morning saying she couldn't handle the poverty and uncertainty, couldn't watch Daniel struggle to provide what other fathers seemed to manage effortlessly. She'd sent cards twice in 4 years, had made promises about visits that never materialized, had remarried someone stable and started a new family that didn't include the son she'd abandoned. Daniel had stopped being angry about it, had redirected that energy toward making sure Lucas knew he was wanted even when circumstances were hard. But wanting wasn't the same as providing, and Daniel was running out of ways to shield his son from the reality that they were sliding toward homelessness with no clear path back to stability. The county foreclosure auction happened every third Wednesday at the courthouse, a public display of failure where properties nobody wanted were sold to whoever showed up with cash. Daniel attended out of desperation rather than hope, scanning the list of seized assets for anything that might represent shelter even temporarily. Most listings were trash, condemned houses, lots with unpaid tax liens, commercial properties so deteriorated they'd cost more to demolish than they were worth. But one caught his attention. An abandoned cooperage on 3 acres outside Ashford Hollow, Tennessee, starting bid $450. A cooperage was a barrel-making facility, the kind of specialized operation that had thrived when whiskey distilling was regional industry before consolidation killed small producers. This one had been closed since 1983, the listing said, seized for back taxes after 40 years of abandonment. Daniel researched what he could on his phone during Lucas's school hours. The Riverside Cooperage had been built in 1891 by the Brennan family, had produced barrels for every distillery in the county until cheap industrial production made traditional cooperages obsolete. The last owner, William Brennan, had died in 1983 at age 97, leaving no heirs and a property so deteriorated the county couldn't find buyers even at tax sale prices. The listing showed photographs of industrial decay, collapsed sections of roof, broken windows, rusted equipment scattered across a floor covered in 40 years of leaves and debris. But the building's bones looked solid, its brick walls still standing, its footprint large enough to potentially convert to living space if Daniel had skills and time he didn't have money to support. It was a terrible idea, buying a wreck of a building with his last $450. But it was shelter of a kind, was 3 acres they couldn't be evicted from, was something to show Lucas that his father was still fighting even when fighting looked like desperate gambles on properties nobody else wanted. The auction drew 17 people, most of them investors looking for land to flip or developers hunting cheap acquisitions. Daniel sat in the back with Lucas beside him, both of them quiet as properties sold for amounts that made his $450 look pathetic. When the cooperage came up, the auctioneer's tone suggested he expected no bids at all. Riverside Cooperage, 3.2 acres, structure unsafe for occupation, sold as is with no warranties. Opening bid $450. Daniel raised his hand before he could reconsider, his heart pounding with the recklessness of the choice. The auctioneer looked surprised anyone had bid, scanned the room for competing offers, found none. Sold to bidder 17 for $450. See the clerk for payment processing. Just like that, Daniel owned a derelict cooperage he'd never seen in person, had committed his last dollar to a property that might be worthless. Lucas looked up at him with an expression mixing hope and concern, understanding enough to know they'd just made a choice that couldn't be undone. They drove to the Cooperage that afternoon, following county roads that wound through Tennessee countryside that had seen better days. Closed factories, abandoned gas stations, the remnants of industries that had moved on, leaving communities to figure out what came next. The Cooperage sat at the end of a gravel road so overgrown Daniel wasn't sure his truck could navigate it, surrounded by forest that had reclaimed whatever clearing had once existed. The building was worse than the photographs suggested. 2 stories of brick construction, maybe 12,000 square feet, with sections of roof completely gone and walls showing structural damage from decades of weather exposure. The main doors hung open where vandals or weather had broken the locks, revealing an interior filled with debris and rusted barrel-making equipment that looked like artifacts from another century. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. But it was theirs, was shelter, even if shelter meant sleeping in a truck parked beside a building they couldn't safely enter. Daniel walked the perimeter with Lucas, assessing what he'd bought with his last $450, trying to find hope in a situation that looked increasingly like the worst decision he'd ever made. The property's rear section showed less damage than the front, a brick addition that had been built later and had somehow survived 4 decades of abandonment better than the original structure. Daniel found a door that opened with effort, revealing a storage room that was surprisingly intact, roof solid, windows unbroken, floor clear of major debris. It wasn't much, but it was dry and enclosed, was better than the truck or the streets. He was clearing space for them to sleep when he noticed the floor felt wrong in one corner. Hollow sounding, as if something beneath the concrete gave when he stepped on it. Daniel swept away accumulated dirt and leaves, finding seams that suggested a concealed door rather than solid foundation. He pulled at the edges, finding a metal handle hidden beneath grime, lifting to reveal stairs descending into darkness below the building. Lucas pressed close as Daniel used his phone's flashlight to illuminate a stone stairway leading down maybe 15 feet. The air rising from below was cool and dry, carrying the scent of aged wood and something else Daniel couldn't quite identify. Every instinct said not to explore an unknown cellar in an abandoned building with his 7-year-old son beside him. But desperation made people reckless, and Daniel had already committed to recklessness when he'd bid his last dollar on a property he'd never inspected. The stairs ended in a cellar that took Daniel's breath away. The space was huge, maybe 3,000 square feet, with stone walls and a vaulted ceiling that showed craftsmanship from another era. But it was what filled the cellar that made Daniel's hands shake as he swept his phone's light across the space. Barrels. Hundreds of oak barrels stacked floor to ceiling, arranged in rows that extended into darkness beyond his light's reach. The barrels showed age but not decay, their wood still tight, their metal bands intact. And they were full, Daniel could tell from the weight when he tested one, could hear liquid inside when he tapped the wood. He found a ledger on a desk near the stairs, leather-bound and thick with pages, its entries dating back to 1891. William Brennan's handwriting documented 40 years of barrel production, of sales to distilleries across Tennessee and Kentucky, of an industry that had thrived before consolidation killed small operations. But the ledger's final entries, dated 1943, told a different story. Federal agents seized the Morrison distillery today on prohibition violations they claim extend beyond the repeal. They're investigating everyone who supplied barrels, claiming we facilitated illegal production. I've moved the reserve stock to the cellar, every barrel we held for aging per our agreement with Morrison. 380 barrels of 12-year whiskey, worth a fortune if the legal troubles pass, worth nothing if the government seizes everything. I'm hiding this note with the ledger so whoever finds it understands, this whiskey belongs to whoever owns this property honestly. The government claimed Morrison's land and equipment, but they never found the barrels we held in our cellars. That makes them mine to protect or pass on as I see fit. The entry was dated October 1943, written by William Brennan's father Edward, who'd run the Cooperage before him. Daniel flipped through pages showing decades of entries after 1943, all of them documenting William's solitary work maintaining the building and the hidden cellar, protecting barrels that had been left in his family's care 80 years ago. The final entry, dated January 1983, was in different handwriting, shaky but determined. I'm 97 years old and dying. The Cooperage has been closed for years, the building falling apart around me. I've spent my entire life protecting these barrels, keeping the cellar sealed in secret, maintaining what my father entrusted to me even though the distillery that owned them is long gone and there's no one left to claim them. I'm leaving this property to whoever buys it next, whenever that happens. The barrels and whatever they're worth belong to whoever has the courage to purchase an abandoned building nobody wants and the sense to look beneath the surface for what previous owners protected. Use this whiskey however you see fit. I've protected it for 80 years because my father asked me to, but protection isn't the same as purpose. Build something with what I've left. Don't let it sit in darkness forever the way I have. Signed, William Brennan, January 15, 1983. Daniel read the entry 3 times. Lucas pressed against his side trying to understand what they'd found. 380 barrels of 80-year-old whiskey hidden beneath an abandoned cooperage, protected through 2 generations, left for whoever bought the property and was desperate enough or curious enough to explore what others had ignored. He used his phone to research whiskey values, finding that aged bourbon and Tennessee whiskey could be worth thousands per bottle if properly authenticated and legally saleable. The barrels held who knew how many bottles, maybe 100 per barrel if the whiskey was still good, maybe more. The numbers became astronomical, became the kind of wealth that transformed desperate circumstances into security he couldn't otherwise imagine. But Daniel had learned through 4 years of single parenthood and struggling that anything that seemed too good to be true usually was. The whiskey would need authentication, would need legal verification that it could be sold, would need expertise he didn't have and couldn't afford. And abandoned properties with hidden fortunes attracted attention from people who believed they deserved what others had found through accident and desperation. He was photographing the ledger entries when he heard vehicles approaching on the gravel road outside. 2 trucks, diesel engines audible even through the Cooperage's thick walls. Daniel climbed the stairs quickly with Lucas, emerging into the storage room as 2 men walked through the building's open front entrance. The older one, maybe 60, stopped when he saw Daniel and Lucas. His expression showed surprise and something else, recognition that the property wasn't as abandoned as he'd expected. "You're trespassing on private property," Daniel said, keeping his voice level despite the adrenaline flooding through him. "This is the old Brennan Cooperage," the man said, his tone carrying authority he expected would matter. "Been abandoned for 40 years. I'm Thomas Garrett, I own Garrett Distilling. This land borders my family's property, has for 3 generations. We've been waiting for it to come up for sale. It did come up for sale. At county auction this morning. I bought it." Daniel pulled out the auction receipt, proof of ownership that was hours old but legally binding. Thomas Garrett's expression hardened. "You bought the Cooperage? At auction? For $450. It's mine now, which makes you the one who's trespassing." The younger man with Thomas stepped forward, his body language suggesting this was the son who'd been raised to take what the father claimed. "Nobody told us there was an auction today. We've been monitoring this property for years, waiting for the county to finally foreclose on the tax liens. You had no right to bid without checking whether there were prior claims. There were no prior claims, just an auction that was publicly advertised. I bid, nobody else did, I own the property." Daniel moved to block the cellar entrance behind him, instinct telling him that whatever these men wanted had nothing to do with the building's ruins and everything to do with what lay beneath it. Thomas studied Daniel with calculating attention. "You don't know what you've bought, do you? This isn't just an old Cooperage. There's history here, agreements between families, understandings about what happens to properties when they change hands. Then you should have shown up at the auction." Daniel kept Lucas behind him, kept his body between his son and men who were making clear this wasn't a friendly visit. "The property's mine. I'd like you to leave." Thomas Garrett didn't move. "I'm prepared to offer you $5,000 for the Cooperage. That's more than 10 times what you paid, represents a substantial profit for a few hours of ownership." It's a generous offer for a property you can't possibly develop or afford to maintain. $5,000 was more money than Daniel had seen in months, was enough to find an apartment and buy time to find work. But the offer came too quickly, was presented with too much confidence, suggested Thomas Garrett knew or suspected something about the Cooperage that made it worth far more than $5,000. It's not for sale, Daniel heard himself say. I bought it to live on, to give my son and me a place that can't be taken away by evictions or rent we can't afford. You're welcome to make offers later if I change my mind, but right now the answer is no. Thomas's professional courtesy evaporated. You're making a mistake. This property has complications you don't understand, history that goes back generations. Refusing to sell now will lead to problems you're not equipped to handle. Is that a threat? It's friendly advice from someone who knows more about this land than you do. Thomas pulled out a business card, dropped it on the floor since Daniel wouldn't take it. When you reconsider, call me. The offer won't last forever. After they left, Daniel stood in the storage room feeling his hands shake with adrenaline and recognition that he'd just made enemies of people who clearly believed they had claims to property they'd never actually purchased. Lucas was quiet beside him, his 7-year-old awareness processing adult tensions he shouldn't have had to navigate. Are we keeping the building? Lucas asked quietly. Daniel looked at his son, at the boy who'd grown up watching his father struggle, who'd learned to read eviction notices and count remaining dollars and accept that childhood should include stability they'd never quite achieved. He thought about the cellar beneath them, about William Brennan's note entrusting what he'd protected to whoever bought the property honestly, about Thomas Garrett showing up within hours of the auction to pressure an owner he'd never met. Yeah, Daniel said. We're keeping it. This is ours now, whatever that means and whatever it costs to defend. The Cooperage waited in gathering darkness, its ruined sections visible through broken walls, its hidden cellar holding secrets that had rested for 80 years, its ownership transferred to a desperate father who'd bid his last dollar and discovered that sometimes desperate gambles led to places that tested whether you had courage to stand for things you'd acquired through accident rather than design. The barrels sat in darkness below, waiting to be authenticated or claimed or fought over, representing wealth Daniel couldn't comprehend and complications he was just beginning to understand. Daniel spent the first night in the Cooperage's storage room with Lucas curled against him in sleeping bags bought years ago for camping trips they'd never had money to take. The building creaked and settled around them, its ruined sections allowing wind to whistle through gaps that made the darkness feel alive. But they were inside, were sheltered from November cold, were sleeping on property nobody could evict them from as long as Daniel could afford the property taxes he hadn't yet calculated. Morning revealed the Cooperage in harsh detail. The main production floor was beyond salvaging, roof collapsed in 3 places, brick walls cracked from water damage, equipment so rusted it had fused to the floor. But the storage room and the office section beside it showed potential if Daniel had skills and materials he couldn't afford. The cellar remained sealed below, its stairs hidden by the concealed door, its 380 barrels waiting for authentication or discovery by people who'd made claiming them complicated. Lucas ate cereal from a box while Daniel used his phone to research whiskey authentication and legal ownership of found assets. What he learned was both encouraging and terrifying. The whiskey could potentially be worth millions if it was authentic pre-prohibition or immediate post-prohibition stock, if it had aged properly, if it could be legally sold. But authentication required expensive testing, legal sale required navigating federal alcohol regulations, and claiming ownership of assets hidden on property you'd just purchased opened questions about previous owners' intent and heir claims. He found a lawyer in the county seat who specialized in property law, a woman named Catherine Morris who agreed to a consultation for $200 Daniel didn't have but borrowed from a credit card he'd been trying to pay down. They met in her office while Lucas sat in the waiting room doing homework, both of them navigating poverty's constant requirement to include children in adult business they shouldn't have to witness. Catherine listened to Daniel's explanation of the Cooperage purchase and the cellar discovery, her expression showing she understood both the opportunity and the complications. She was maybe 50, with the worn competence of someone who'd spent decades helping people navigate legal systems designed to favor those with resources. The whiskey is legally yours if it was abandoned on property you purchased legitimately, Catherine explained. Tennessee law regarding found assets is fairly straightforward. Property left on land transfers with the land unless there are documented claims from heirs or previous owners. William Brennan's note establishes clear intent to transfer the barrels to whoever bought the cooperage. But Daniel heard the hesitation in her voice. But claiming ownership and actually selling the whiskey are different things. You'll need authentication from certified experts, you'll need to verify the whiskey is safe for consumption, you'll need federal approval for sale since alcohol is heavily regulated. All of that costs money and takes time. She pulled out papers documenting the process. We're looking at tens of thousands in fees and testing before you could legally sell a single bottle. I have $400. Daniel said it flatly, the reality of his situation stripping away any pretense. That's why I bought a foreclosed cooperage instead of paying rent. I can't afford tens of thousands for anything. Catherine was quiet for a moment, studying Daniel with an attention that suggested she was making calculations beyond simple legal advice. There may be options. If the whiskey is authentic and valuable, you could potentially get loans against its appraised value. But that requires preliminary authentication, which still costs several $1,000s minimum. Which I don't have. Which you don't have. She leaned forward. Mr. Carter, I'm going to be direct with you. Thomas Garrett showing up within hours of your purchase suggests he knows or suspects what's in that cellar. The Garrett family has been in the distilling business for 4 generations. If they're interested in your property this quickly, it's not because they want the building. So what do? You protect your ownership legally, you document everything, and you don't let anyone pressure you into selling before you understand what you actually have. Catherine's expression showed she'd seen this pattern before. Families like the Garretts are skilled at acquiring properties through methods that aren't quite illegal but aren't quite ethical. They'll offer you money that seems generous while actually being a fraction of real value. They'll create legal complications that force you to spend money defending your rights. They'll make ownership so expensive and difficult that selling looks reasonable. After the consultation, Daniel drove back to the cooperage with Lucas, both of them processing information that made their situation clearer but not easier. He'd bought property that might contain millions in aged whiskey, but claiming that wealth required resources he didn't have and would face opposition from people who had 4 generations of experience getting what they wanted. The cooperage looked even worse in afternoon light, its decay undeniable, its conversion to livable space requiring skills and money Daniel couldn't access. But it was theirs, was proof that he was still fighting for Lucas even when fighting meant desperate gambles on properties nobody else wanted. He was assessing the storage room's roof when a woman in her 70s arrived driving a truck that had seen better decades. She introduced herself as Helen Morrison, said she'd heard through town gossip that someone had finally bought the old Brennan cooperage. I knew William Brennan, Helen said, settling onto the truck's tailgate with the ease of someone whose bones remembered rural work. He was a friend of my late husband. We used to visit him here in the 70s, before he got too old to maintain the place. He talked about the barrels sometimes, about protecting what his father had left him. You knew about the cellar? Daniel kept his voice neutral, uncertain whether this was friendly visit or intelligence gathering. I knew William's father had stored barrels for Morrison Distillery before the government shut them down in the 40s. Knew William had protected those barrels his whole life, though I never saw the cellar myself. He was secretive about it, said the fewer people who knew the better. Helen looked at the cooperage with eyes that saw past current decay into previous purpose. The Morrisons were my husband's family. The distillery the government seized was started by my husband's grandfather in 1889. Daniel felt pieces falling into place. The whiskey in the cellar belonged to your family. Belonged to my husband's family, yes. Though they're all gone now, the government seizure bankrupted them, broke my father-in-law's health. He died in 1952 still fighting legal battles to recover what had been taken. The rest of the family scattered, moved on to other work. She paused. I'm not here to claim the barrels, if that's what you're wondering. I'm here because I heard the Garretts visited you yesterday, and I wanted you to understand what you're up against. Over the next hour, Helen explained history that gave context to Thomas Garrett's immediate interest in the cooperage. The Garrett and Morrison families had been rivals since the 1920s, competing distillers in a county where whiskey production was cultural identity and economic foundation. When federal agents had seized Morrison Distillery in 1943, the Garretts had quietly purchased the property and equipment at government auction, had built their current operation on land that had belonged to their competitors. Thomas Garrett's grandfather always believed there were barrels the government never found, Helen said. The Morrison inventory records showed 380 barrels held at Brennan Cooperage for aging, but the Brennans claimed they'd returned them before the seizure. The government investigated, found nothing, eventually dropped it. But the Garretts never stopped believing those barrels existed somewhere. And now they know they do. Now they know you found them, yes. Which means Thomas will do whatever it takes to acquire them, buy your property if you'll sell, pressure you legally if you won't, make your ownership so complicated that giving up looks reasonable. Helen's expression showed she'd watched the Garretts use these tactics before. They've been acquiring properties in this county for 70 years through methods that walk the line between legal and ethical. They're patient, they're resourceful, and they're not above using law as weapon when straightforward purchase fails. After Helen left, Daniel spent the afternoon documenting the cellar more thoroughly, photographing every barrel, recording William Brennan's ledger entries, creating evidence that would establish his ownership if the Garretts challenged it legally. Lucas helped, his 7-year-old seriousness understanding that what they were protecting mattered even if he didn't fully grasp why. The pressure began the next day. A building inspector arrived claiming anonymous complaints about unsafe structures, threatened to condemn the Cooperage unless Daniel made repairs he couldn't afford. A tax assessor showed up to reevaluate the property value, suggesting the Cooperage might be worth significantly more than the $450 Daniel had paid, which would increase his tax burden. A representative from the county health department cited environmental violations that would require expensive remediation. Catherine Morris explained what was happening when Daniel called her in a panic. This is how they operate. They use legitimate regulatory channels to create expensive compliance requirements. Each citation is technically valid, but the timing and coordination suggest someone with influence is making calls to make your ownership as difficult as possible. Can they actually condemn the property? If you don't address the safety violations, yes. But addressing them requires money for permits and contractors and materials. That's the point, make ownership expensive enough that you can't sustain it. Catherine paused. Daniel, I need you to understand something. Fighting the Garretts will require resources you don't have. Even if you're legally right, even if the whiskey is yours, defending your position will cost more than you can afford unless you find ways to fund the fight. That night, Thomas Garrett called Daniel directly. The call came after Lucas was asleep, the older man's voice carrying practiced reasonableness that made threats sound like helpful advice. Mr. Carter, I understand you've been dealing with building inspectors and county officials. That's unfortunate, but it's the reality of owning a property with code violations. I'm prepared to increase my offer to $50,000 for the Cooperage and its contents. That's more than 100 times what you paid, represents substantial profit and relief from mounting compliance costs. The contents include 380 barrels of whiskey your family has been looking for since 1943, Daniel said quietly. Whiskey that could be worth millions if properly authenticated and sold. $50,000 is insulting. Thomas's tone hardened. Those barrels belong to Morrison Distillery, which my family purchased at government auction in 1944. They were held by the Brennans as temporary storage, which means they should have transferred to us when we acquired Morrison's assets. Your claim to own them is legally questionable at best. William Brennan's documentation says otherwise. His father stored them before the seizure, protected them through 80 years, and left them to whoever bought this property. That makes them mine regardless of what your family believes you're owed. We'll see what courts say about that. Property disputes are expensive, Mr. Carter. Discovery alone will cost tens of thousands. Expert witnesses, authentication testing, legal research, you'll spend more fighting for those barrels than you could earn from any reasonable settlement. My offer represents pragmatic resolution to a situation you can't win through litigation. After Thomas hung up, Daniel sat in darkness listening to Lucas breathe and sleep, feeling the weight of choices that would determine whether his son grew up with stability or continued learning that poverty meant constant fighting against forces with more resources and patience. $50,000 was more money than Daniel had earned in the best year of his life, could provide security he couldn't otherwise guarantee. But accepting it meant surrendering barrels worth potentially millions, meant teaching Lucas that powerful people could take what they wanted if they applied enough pressure. He called Catherine the next morning, explained Thomas's offer and threats. Her response confirmed what Daniel already knew. They'll file claims asserting the barrels were Morrison property that should have transferred when the Garretts purchased the distillery. It's a weak legal argument, the barrels were stored at a separate facility owned by different people, but it's enough to create expensive litigation. Even if you win eventually, you'll spend years and substantial money defending your ownership. She hesitated. Daniel, I hate saying this, but you need to seriously consider whether fighting is worth the cost. $50,000 could change your and Lucas's life even if it's a fraction of the barrel's potential value. If I sell, what does that teach my son? That standing for things is expensive, so you should surrender when powerful people pressure you? It teaches him that survival sometimes requires pragmatic choices over principled stands. That's not weakness, Daniel. That's understanding that protecting your child matters more than proving points to families who've spent generations perfecting pressure tactics. Daniel spent that afternoon exploring the Cooperage more thoroughly, finding William Brennan's personal quarters in a section he'd initially missed. The old man had lived here in his final years, had maintained a small apartment above the office, had documented his life through journals and photographs that revealed the lonely burden of protecting barrels nobody else knew existed. One journal entry from 1976 was particularly striking. I'm 89 years old and the last person alive who remembers why these barrels matter. My father made a promise to Morrison that he'd protect their inventory, that he'd keep the barrels safe until they could reclaim them. But Morrison's family is gone, bankrupted by government seizure and Garrett acquisition of their land. I've protected these barrels for 33 years, maintaining the cellar, checking the inventory, ensuring what my father hid stays hidden. But I'm tired, and I'm old, and I wonder if protection has become prison. I've spent my life guarding barrels nobody will claim, wealth nobody can use, promised to people who are dead. When I die, this burden transfers to whoever buys this property next. I hope they're wiser than I've been, hope they understand that protection isn't the same as purpose. Reading William's regrets, Daniel understood more fully what he'd inherited. Not just property and whiskey, but the burden of decisions that would define whether he repeated William's mistakes, protecting things at the cost of living, or learn from them by understanding that some fights were worth having and some required different forms of courage than simple stubborn defense. The confrontation happened 3 days later. Thomas Garrett arrived with his son Robert and 2 men who carried themselves like lawyers, all of them walking onto Daniel's property with the confidence of people who expected their authority to matter. Daniel met them at the Cooperage's entrance with Lucas staying behind in the storage room, both understanding this was adult business that would shape everything that came next. We've filed a legal claim asserting ownership of the whiskey barrels stored on this property, Thomas said, handing Daniel papers that formalized what had been threats into actual litigation. Our position is that those barrels were Morrison Distillery property that should have transferred to us when we purchased Morrison's assets in 1944. Your possession of them is legally questionable. Daniel read the filing, seeing arguments that sounded plausible to anyone who didn't know the full history. The Brennans stored those barrels before the Morrison seizure. William's father documented that they were held as independent Cooperage inventory, not as Morrison property. Your claim has no merit. That's for courts to decide. What I'm offering is an opportunity to avoid litigation that will bankrupt you regardless of outcome. Thomas's expression showed he believed this was settled, that Daniel would recognize the inevitable and surrender. We'll purchase the Cooperage for $100,000. That's final offer, substantially more than you'd clear after legal fees from defending your claim. $100,000 was life-changing money, was security Daniel couldn't otherwise access. But it was also surrender to people who believed their patience and resources entitled them to take what they hadn't legitimately purchased, who would use law as weapon to exhaust anyone who resisted their acquisition. The property isn't for sale, Daniel said. Not for $100,000, not for any amount you'd actually pay. The barrels were left to whoever bought this Cooperage honestly, and that's me. If you want to fight about it in court, we'll fight. Robert Garrett stepped forward, his anger less controlled than his father's. You don't have money for lawyers, don't have resources to authenticate the whiskey, don't have any way to actually win this. You're refusing our offer out of stubborn pride that will leave you with nothing except legal bills you can't pay. Maybe. But I'm teaching my son that some things matter more than money, that standing against people who think they can take what they want matters even when standing costs everything. Daniel met Robert's eyes. Your family has been trying to claim these barrels for 80 years. You failed then, and you'll fail now, because wanting something doesn't entitle you to it no matter how patient you are. After they left, Daniel stood shaking with adrenaline and recognition that he'd just committed to a fight he couldn't afford against people who had generations of experience winning through attrition. Catherine had warned him this would be expensive, had cautioned that principal didn't pay legal bills. But Daniel had made his choice, had decided that teaching Lucas about standing for things mattered more than pragmatic surrender. Lucas emerged from the storage room, his 7-year-old face showing the worry children carry when they understand their parent is struggling. Are we going to lose the building? I don't know, buddy. But we're not giving up without fighting. Sometimes that's all you can do, stand for what's right even when standing is hard. That evening, Helen Morrison returned with news that complicated everything further. She'd been researching family records, had found documentation from her late husband's grandfather that changed the legal equation entirely. Morrison Distillery entered into a formal agreement with Brennan Cooperage in 1931, Helen explained, showing Daniel papers that were 90 years old but still legible. They contracted to store barrels for aging, with ownership remaining with Morrison until the barrels were retrieved or sold. But there's a clause here that matters. If Morrison failed to retrieve the barrels within 10 years of storage, ownership transferred to the Brennans as payment for continued aging services. Daniel read the contract, seeing language that established clear timeline. The barrels had been stored in 1933, which meant ownership should have transferred to the Brennans in 1943, the same year the government seized Morrison Distillery. The transfer happened before the Garretts purchased Morrison's assets, which meant the barrels were never part of what the Garretts acquired. This proves the barrels belonged to William Brennan, not to Morrison and not to the Garretts, Daniel said, feeling hope for the first time since the litigation began. It proves the Garretts' claim has no legal merit, yes. But it also means you'll need to present this evidence in court, which requires lawyers and time and money you don't have. Helen paused. I'm willing to help, Daniel. My husband's family lost everything to government seizure and Garrett acquisition. If there's a chance to recover even part of their legacy, to show that the Garretts don't always win through patience and pressure, I want to support that. Over the following weeks, Helen became an unexpected ally in ways that revealed how complicated small-town loyalties were. She connected Daniel with people who remembered the Brennans and Morrisons, who'd watched the Garretts acquire properties through methods that weren't illegal but weren't ethical. She loaned him money for preliminary whiskey authentication, covering tests that would establish whether the barrels actually contained valuable aged stock or had degraded over 80 years into worthlessness. The authentication results came back stunning. The whiskey was genuine pre-1943 Tennessee stock, had aged remarkably well in sealed oak barrels, showed quality that experts said could command premium prices if properly marketed. Conservative estimates put the total value at $8 to $12 million if sold through legitimate channels over several years. The barrels represented fortune that transformed the Cooperage from desperate gamble into foundation for security Daniel had never imagined possible. But the Garretts' litigation proceeded regardless of authentication or contractual evidence. They filed motions asserting the 1931 agreement was fraudulent, demanded access to the cellar for their own testing, requested injunctions preventing Daniel from moving or selling any barrels pending resolution. Each filing required response, required Catherine's time billable at rates that mounted despite her reduced fees, required Daniel to fight battles on fronts he didn't understand with resources he barely had. The pressure extended beyond legal filings. The building inspector returned with more citations. The county threatened liens for unpaid compliance costs. Someone filed complaints with child services suggesting Lucas was living in unsafe conditions. Each action was technically legitimate but suspiciously coordinated, designed to make Daniel's life so complicated that surrender looked reasonable. Through it all, Lucas watched and learned, his childhood shaped by seeing his father fight for principles when fighting was expensive, seeing community members help when help meant standing against powerful families, seeing that some things mattered enough to defend even when defense cost everything you had. He'd grown quieter over the months, more serious, shaped by poverty and struggle into awareness that 7-year-olds shouldn't have to carry. But he'd also grown proud, had told his teacher about his father standing up to people who tried to take what wasn't theirs, had absorbed lessons about courage that went deeper than simple stubbornness into understanding that character was revealed through choices you made when the world stopped being fair. On a cold evening in March, 6 months after Daniel had bought the Cooperage for $450, Catherine called with news that shifted everything. The court had ruled on preliminary motions, had found the 1931 contract valid and dispositive, had dismissed the Garrett's ownership claim with prejudice. The barrels were legally Daniel's, the whiskey could be authenticated and sold, the fight was over in ways that represented complete victory rather than expensive stalemate. They can appeal, but it's unlikely to succeed given how thoroughly the judge rejected their arguments, Catherine said, her voice carrying relief and triumph. You won, Daniel. The Cooperage is yours, the whiskey is yours, and the Garretts can't take it through litigation. After hanging up, Daniel stood in the Cooperage that had transformed from desperate gamble into foundation for everything that came next, feeling the weight of 6 months settle into something approaching vindication. He'd stood against pressure that should have broken him, had fought with resources he didn't have, had refused to surrender because teaching Lucas about standing for things mattered more than pragmatic acceptance of defeat. The barrels waited below in their cellar, holding whiskey that would fund years of stability, that would transform poverty into security, that would prove desperate people who tried impossible things sometimes got rewarded with chances to become who they were meant to be. William Brennan had protected them for 80 years, had died believing someone would use them better than he had. Daniel had honored that trust not through simple claiming but through standing for principles William had lived by, that protection mattered, that promises extended beyond one lifetime, that inheritance came with obligations to fight for what you'd been given even when fighting was expensive. The Cooperage breathed in the evening air, its ruins still waiting for restoration, its future secured through legal victory that had cost everything but had proven that some fights were worth having regardless of cost. And Lucas slept in the storage room that had become home, shaped by 6 months of watching his father refuse to surrender, learning lessons about courage and principle that would define who he became when the world tested him with choices between comfort and standing for what mattered. The court victory brought relief but not simplicity. Daniel owned the barrels legally, but transforming 80-year-old whiskey into actual income required navigating federal alcohol regulations, finding buyers willing to authenticate and purchase aged stock, negotiating with distributors who saw opportunity in rare Tennessee whiskey but who also knew Daniel's desperate circumstances gave them leverage in pricing. Catherine connected him with a whiskey broker named James Patterson who specialized in rare and aged spirits. James drove down from Kentucky 3 weeks after the court ruling, his expertise immediately apparent as he examined the cellar with the careful attention of someone who understood both the science and the business of aged whiskey. He was maybe 60, carried himself with the quiet authority of someone who'd spent decades in an industry where reputation mattered more than credentials. "This is extraordinary," James said after inspecting 50 barrels randomly selected from the 380. Pre-1943 Tennessee whiskey aged in oak for 80 years. The char on these barrels is perfect, the seal's held, the evaporation loss is minimal. You're sitting on $8 to $10 million if we market this properly over the next several years. Daniel felt the number like physical weight, the kind of wealth that existed in theory but felt impossible to actually access. How long will it take to actually see money? We'll need 6 months for complete authentication and federal approval. Then we'll begin selling to collectors and distributors, probably 20 to 30 barrels a year to maintain premium pricing. You'll see initial payments within a year, with full realization taking 5 to 7 years. James pulled out contracts detailing the broker arrangement. I'll handle authentication costs and marketing, take 20% of gross sales. You'll receive 80% distributed over the sales period. The contract was fair by industry standards, Catherine confirmed, though Daniel had no leverage to negotiate better terms and no expertise to manage sales himself. He signed the agreements, committed to a process that would transform the Cellar's contents into security spread across years rather than immediate windfalls. The first payment arrived 11 months later, $300,000 from the sale of 18 bottles to collectors and specialty distributors. Daniel stared at the bank balance showing more money than he'd earned in his entire working life, feeling disconnected from the number, struggling to believe that poverty that had defined his adult years could actually end through accident and stubbornness rather than careful planning. He used the first money carefully, guided by Catherine's advice about managing sudden wealth in ways that provided stability rather than just consumption. He paid off the credit card debt that had accumulated during the legal fight, established a trust for Lucas's education, set aside reserves for taxes and emergencies. But he also committed significant funds to restoring the Cooperage, not just as shelter but as something that honored William Brennan's 80 years of protection. The restoration took 3 years, guided by architects who specialized in historic preservation and contractors who understood that the goal was respectful renovation rather than modern transformation. They stabilized the main production floor's remaining walls, rebuilt the collapsed roof sections, restored the barrel-making equipment to display condition. The office and storage areas became a museum documenting Cooperage history and the whiskey industry's role in Tennessee's economy. William Brennan's journals and photographs filled exhibits that told the story of a man who'd spent his life protecting barrels nobody knew existed. But Daniel also created something new. The Cooperage's upper floor became a community education center focused on traditional crafts and skilled trades, woodworking, metalwork, barrel making taught by instructors who understood these were dying skills worth preserving. The programs served high school students and adults looking to learn trades, offered scholarships to families who couldn't afford tuition, created pathways into skilled work for people facing the same economic desperation Daniel had escaped through accident rather than planning. Lucas grew through these years of transformation, shaped by watching the Cooperage evolve from ruin to purpose, by seeing his father build something meaningful with wealth that could have been simply consumed. He was 10 when the restoration began, 13 when it completed, old enough to understand that the money mattered less than what it funded, that wealth was tool rather than destination. He'd developed his father's quiet intensity, had absorbed lessons about standing for things through years of watching Daniel fight and rebuild. He helped with the museum exhibits, learned basic Cooperage skills from the instructors Daniel hired, showed visitors through spaces that had been home when home meant sleeping in a storage room while poverty pressed from all sides. "Do you remember being poor?" a classmate asked him once during a school project about the Cooperage's history. Lucas had thought about the question carefully before answering. "I remember my dad being scared but not showing it. I remember eating cereal for dinner because that's what we had. I remember the eviction notice and the auction and sleeping here before the building was fixed. But mostly I remember Dad refusing to give up even when giving up would have been easier. That matters more than remembering being poor." Helen Morrison became frequent visitor during the restoration years, her presence connecting the Cooperage's present purpose to its complicated past. She contributed Morrison family documents to the museum, photographs of the distillery before government seizure, records showing her husband's family's business before the Garretts had acquired their assets and land. "My father-in-law died believing his family's legacy was erased," Helen said one afternoon while reviewing exhibits before the museum's opening. "He spent his final years fighting legal battles he couldn't win, trying to recover what government seizure and Garrett acquisition had taken. Seeing this place restored, seeing the whiskey his family produced finally sold properly, seeing that the Garretts didn't get what they wanted, it would have meant everything to him. She'd become something like family over the years, had filled grandmother's role for Lucas that his own grandparents, dead or absent, couldn't provide. She taught him Morrison family history, shared stories about Tennessee distilling before consolidation killed small producers, gave him connection to the whiskey barrel's origins that went beyond simple financial value into understanding of craft and tradition. The Garretts' response to the court loss and the Cooperage's restoration was complicated silence. Thomas made no public statements about the case, continued running his distillery with the professional competence that had made it regionally successful. But he didn't attend the Cooperage's museum opening, didn't acknowledge Daniel's transformation of the property, maintained distance that suggested defeat had left wounds pride wouldn't let him admit to. His son Robert was less restrained. He made comments to local reporters suggesting Daniel had stolen whiskey through legal technicalities, that the Brennans had fraudulently hidden Morrison property, that the court's ruling represented theft disguised as legitimate ownership. The statements were careful enough to avoid libel, bitter enough to show how deeply the loss had cut. But there were also unexpected gestures. A donation to the Cooperage's education programs appeared from an anonymous source Catherine traced to a Garrett family trust. Equipment for the woodworking shop arrived with a note saying only for the students. The gifts were never acknowledged publicly, never claimed as reconciliation, but they suggested that somewhere beneath bitterness was recognition that what Daniel had built served purposes that transcended their family's defeat. 5 years after buying the Cooperage for $450, Daniel attended Thomas Garrett's funeral. The old man had died at 81, his obituary noting 6 decades in the distilling business and 4 generations of family tradition. Daniel went not because they'd been friends but because small-town courtesy required presence at funerals of people who'd shaped your life even through conflict. Robert Garrett found him after the service, both men navigating the awkward territory of reconciliation that wasn't quite forgiveness but was acknowledgement that battles end even when winners and losers remain clear. "My father spent his final years angry about those barrels," Robert said quietly, standing beside Daniel in the church parking lot. "Angry that your purchase happened before we could acquire the property, angry that the court dismissed our claim, angry that you turned the Cooperage into something that honors the Morrisons rather than acknowledging Garrett contributions to the industry. I'm sorry he died angry. That's a hard way to end. It was his choice. I told him to let it go, told him the fight was over and continuing to carry bitterness served no one. But he couldn't." Robert paused, looking at the funeral home where his father's body waited for burial. "I won't make the same mistake. The Cooperage is yours, the whiskey was legally yours, and what you've built there serves the community better than our family's acquisition would have. I'm officially ending any remaining disputes." After Robert left, Daniel stood alone processing the conversation, understanding that some victories came with the hollow satisfaction of defeating people who'd died carrying grudges they couldn't release. Thomas Garrett had fought for barrels his grandfather had sought, had lost that fight, and had died bitter about loss that represented family obsession spanning 3 generations. There was no triumph in that, just the recognition that inheritance sometimes passed down damage along with assets. The Cooperage's education programs grew beyond Daniel's initial vision, funded by steady whiskey sales that continued generating income as rare bottles commanded premium prices from collectors. By the program's 5th year, they'd trained 230 students in traditional crafts, had placed 60% of graduates into skilled trade positions, had created pathways into middle-class stability for families facing the economic desperation Daniel remembered from his own bottom. He'd hired instructors who understood that teaching skills was teaching dignity, that showing young people they could build things with their hands gave them options beyond service jobs or leaving the county entirely. The programs attracted attention from regional news outlets, from foundations interested in rural economic development, from politicians looking for success stories in communities that had been slowly dying as industries moved on. But Daniel deflected recognition, uncomfortable with praise for building something that had started with desperation and accident rather than careful planning. He'd bought the Cooperage because he had $450 and nowhere else to go, had found the barrels through curiosity rather than brilliance, had fought the Garretts because surrender felt like failure rather than because he'd understood legal strategy. "You're too hard on yourself," Catherine told him during one of their regular meetings about trust management and program funding. "Luck got you started, but choice built what you've created. You could have taken the Garrett's money and lived comfortably. Instead you fought for ownership, then used that ownership to build something that serves people beyond yourself. That's not accident, Daniel. That's character." Lucas turned 16 during the Cooperage's 6th year of operation, old enough to work officially as museum guide and program assistant, old enough to understand the full arc of transformation from eviction notice to community asset. He'd been shaped by the journey in ways Daniel saw but couldn't fully measure, more serious than his peers, more aware of how quickly stability could disappear, more committed to understanding that wealth mattered through what you built with it rather than simply possessing it. "I want to study business and nonprofit management in college," Lucas said one evening while they ate dinner in the house Daniel had purchased near the Cooperage. "Want to learn how to run programs like ours, how to use resources to help communities that are struggling the way we were." Daniel felt his throat tighten with pride that had nothing to do with Lucas's choices and everything to do with the values that had shaped those choices. His son had grown up watching desperation transform into purpose, had absorbed lessons about standing for principles and using fortune to build rather than simply consume. Whatever mistakes Daniel had made as father, whatever struggles poverty had forced Lucas to witness, his son had emerged with character that honored both the struggle and the inheritance. The whiskey sales continued over years, each batch commanding prices that seemed impossible to Daniel even as bank balances proved the numbers real. James Patterson managed the process with expertise that justified his 20% commission, found buyers who appreciated the whiskey's quality and history, maintained premium pricing through careful market management. By the 8th year, Daniel had received $6 million from sales, with another $2 to $3 million expected as the remaining barrels were gradually sold. The wealth had transformed his circumstances completely, had provided security he'd never known, had funded the Cooperage's restoration and programs and had established trusts that would support Lucas in future generations. But it hadn't changed who Daniel was fundamentally, still careful with money, still uncomfortable with excess, still measuring worth through what he built rather than what he accumulated. He dated occasionally over the years, women who were interested in the Cooperage's director rather than the desperate single father buying foreclosed properties, but nothing had developed into a relationship that felt permanent. Part of him remained shaped by loss, Lucas's mother's abandonment, the poverty years, the sense that stability could disappear regardless of how carefully you planned. He'd built walls that protected but also isolated, had focused on Lucas and the programs in ways that left little space for romantic vulnerability. "You deserve to be happy," Helen told him one afternoon while they reviewed museum attendance numbers. "Not just successful or stable, but actually happy. You've spent 10 years building something remarkable, but you've also spent those years alone." "I'm not alone. I have Lucas, I have the work, I have the community." "You have responsibilities and relationships, yes. But that's not the same as having someone who sees you beyond what you've built, who chose you before the whiskey money and the restored Cooperage, who understands the man rather than just the accomplishment." Helen's expression showed the earned wisdom of someone who'd loved and lost and knew the difference mattered. William Brennan died alone in this building, protecting barrels for 80 years with nobody to share the burden. Don't repeat his mistake by believing protection and purpose are substitutes for connection. Her words stayed with Daniel, complicated his satisfaction with what he'd built by raising questions about what building had cost. He'd succeeded by measures that mattered, had provided for Lucas, had honored William Brennan's trust, had created something that served the community. But he'd also kept himself separate in ways that went beyond simple caution into active avoidance of vulnerability that relationships required. On a warm evening in May, 10 years after Daniel had bought the Cooperage at auction, they held what had become an annual celebration. The Brennan Heritage Festival, a day when the Cooperage opened its museum and programs to the community, when students displayed projects and crafts they'd learned, when families who'd been helped through scholarship programs shared their stories. Lucas gave a speech that year, his first as someone preparing to leave for college in the fall. He spoke about growing up in the Cooperage, about remembering poverty and eviction notices and his father's desperate choices. He spoke about William Brennan's 80 years of protection, about the whiskey that had transformed one family's circumstances while funding programs that had helped hundreds of others. "My dad could have taken the money and disappeared," Lucas said, his voice carrying confidence Daniel had worked to nurture. "Could have sold to the Garretts when they pressured us, could have used the whiskey money for personal comfort rather than community programs. But he chose different. He chose to honor Mr. Brennan's trust by building something that mattered more than just our security, opportunity for families facing the same desperation we escaped through accident and stubbornness." Daniel watched his son speak, feeling the weight of 10 years settle into something approaching peace. Not perfect resolution, because life didn't offer those, but acceptance that he'd honored the trust William Brennan had placed in whoever bought the Cooperage, had used the fortune in ways that served purposes beyond simple accumulation. After the celebration, as evening settled over the Cooperage, Daniel walked through the restored building alone. The museum documented history that extended beyond his personal story into the broader arc of Tennessee whiskey and traditional crafts. The education workshops held equipment and student projects that showed learning in progress. The cellar, now empty of barrels but preserved as historical space, stood as monument to William Brennan's 80 years of protection. He found himself in what had been William's apartment, the small rooms where the old man had lived alone, protecting barrels nobody knew existed, maintaining promises father had made to people who died before that promise could be fulfilled. Daniel had restored these rooms to display condition, had created exhibits showing how William had lived, simply, solitary, dedicated to protection that had consumed his entire adult life. A note in William's final journal, one Daniel had read dozens of times but that still carried weight, seemed particularly relevant. "I've spent my life protecting these barrels because my father asked me to, because keeping promises mattered more than the cost of keeping them. But I wonder if I confuse protection with purpose, if I let maintenance of obligation become substitute for actually living. Whoever finds these barrels after I'm gone, I hope you understand that wealth matters through what you build with it, that inheritance is tool rather than destination, that protection is only valuable if it enables creation rather than just preventing loss. Don't make my mistakes. Don't let what you're protecting consume the life you could be living." Daniel understood more fully what William had been trying to say, understood that his own decade of building programs and restoring the Cooperage had been right use of inherited fortune, but that Helen was also right about risks of letting accomplishment become substitute for actual connection and vulnerability. The Cooperage breathed in the evening air, its walls holding stories that span more than a century, its purpose transformed from whiskey barrel production to community education, its legacy extended through Daniel's choices but also limited by fears he hadn't fully addressed. He'd honored William Brennan's trust by building something meaningful, had provided for Lucas and helped hundreds of families. But he'd also isolated himself in ways that echoed William's lonely protection, had let the work of building become shield against vulnerability that relationships required. As darkness settled and the Cooperage stood solid and purposeful under stars that had looked down on this land before anyone had built barrel-making facilities, Daniel felt something shift in his understanding of what legacy actually meant. It wasn't just protecting what you'd inherited or building programs that served others. It was also allowing yourself to be seen and known, was accepting that connection required risk, was understanding that you couldn't teach your son about courage while avoiding the courage that opening yourself to another person actually required. The Cooperage would stand long after Daniel was gone, would continue teaching and preserving, would remain proof that desperate gambles sometimes led to places that honored both the desperation and the courage it took to try. William Brennan had spent 80 years protecting barrels alone. Daniel had spent 10 years building something meaningful from that protection. But the full measure of honoring William's legacy would be learning from his mistakes, understanding that wealth mattered through what you built, yes, but also that building without connection was its own form of poverty, that true legacy included showing Lucas what it meant to be vulnerable enough for love while strong enough for the work that mattered. The land had given Daniel more than he'd dared hope when he'd bid his last $450 on a property nobody else wanted. It had given him security, purpose, the ability to help others facing circumstances he remembered too well. But it had also taught lessons about protection and isolation, about the difference between honoring inheritance and repeating inheritors' mistakes, about understanding that sometimes the hardest courage was allowing yourself to need someone rather than simply building things that proved you didn't. The Cooperage sat in peaceful darkness, its restoration complete, its programs thriving, its legacy secured through choices Daniel had made over 10 years of transformation. And Daniel stood alone in spaces that had housed William Brennan's lonely protection, understanding that the final lesson of inheritance was learning when to build and when to simply be, when to protect and when to risk, when to honor those who came before by repeating their wisdom and when to honor them more deeply by learning from their mistakes and choosing different paths forward. 15 years passed like seasons across the land, each one leaving its mark on the Cooperage the way water shapes stone. Daniel watched Lucas grow from the 7-year-old boy who'd stood beside him at a county auction to a 22-year-old man running the education programs Daniel had built, his degree in nonprofit management put to use in the place that had shaped his understanding of what service and legacy actually meant. The Cooperage had become something beyond Daniel's initial vision. The education programs served 400 students annually, teaching traditional crafts and skilled trades to people ranging from high school age to adults rebuilding lives after economic hardship. The museum drew visitors from across the region, documenting not just Cooperage history but the broader story of Tennessee whiskey and the communities built around industries that had thrived before consolidation moved production elsewhere. The building itself stood as monument to transformation, from ruin to purpose, from desperate shelter to community asset that honored both the desperation and the courage it had taken to defend. But the most significant transformation had been Daniel's own journey from isolation toward connection. 8 years after buying the Cooperage, he'd met Sarah Chin at a nonprofit conference where he'd been invited to speak about rural education programs. She was an architect who specialized in adaptive reuse of historic buildings, had listened to his presentation about the Cooperage's restoration with the engaged attention of someone who understood that buildings held stories worth preserving. Their relationship had developed slowly, both of them carrying histories that made vulnerability difficult. Sarah had lost her husband to cancer 5 years before they met, had thrown herself into work the way Daniel had used the Cooperage programs to avoid examining what protection had cost. But they'd recognized in each other the particular loneliness of people who'd learned to function alone while quietly aching for connection they'd stopped believing they deserved. They'd married when Lucas was 15, the ceremony held at the Cooperage with Helen Morrison standing as family elder blessing a union that proved William Brennan's warning about dying alone protecting things had taken root in Daniel's understanding. Sarah had brought her own daughter Maya into the marriage, blending their families in ways that required patience and grace but that had given both Lucas and Maya siblings they'd each needed. Helen had passed away 3 years ago at 91, her final years spent volunteering at the museum, sharing Morrison family stories with visitors who wanted to understand the human costs of government seizures and aggressive business acquisitions. She died peacefully, surrounded by people who'd become family through choice rather than blood, leaving behind documentation and memories that kept her husband's family's legacy alive in ways that went beyond simple historical record into actual human connection. Her funeral had drawn unexpected attendance. Robert Garrett had come, now in his 60s and running the family distillery with methods that differed markedly from his father's aggressive acquisition tactics. He'd spoken briefly with Daniel afterward, both men navigating territory that wasn't quite friendship but was mutual respect earned through years of choosing not to continue feuds their fathers had maintained. "My father died angry about those barrels," Robert had said quietly. "Died believing your ownership was theft disguised as legal technicality. But I've spent 15 years watching what you built with the money from those sales, watching the programs help families my father would have ignored, watching you honor the Morrisons and Brennans in ways that serve the community rather than just protecting family pride." He'd paused, choosing words carefully. "Helen told me before she died that the whiskey served better purpose through your stewardship than it would have through my family's acquisition. I think she was right." The final whiskey sales had completed 2 years ago, the last bottles commanding premium prices from collectors who understood they were purchasing more than aged spirits, they were buying pieces of history, remnants of an industry and era that had been transformed by consolidation and regulation. The total proceeds over 15 years had exceeded $9 million, wealth that had funded the Cooperage's restoration and programs while establishing trusts that would support operations for generations. But Daniel had also learned that wealth's true measure was what it enabled rather than what it accumulated. The money had provided security, yes, but more importantly it had funded opportunity for people facing circumstances he remembered viscerally, the desperation of poverty, the grinding exhaustion of barely surviving, the sense that trying was pointless because the world was rigged against people without resources or connections. The education programs had trained over 2,000 students in 15 years, had placed 73% into skilled trade positions that paid middle-class wages, had created pathways out of poverty for families who'd believed such paths didn't exist for people like them. The museum had documented history that honored working people rather than just celebrating industrial success, had preserved stories about the Brennans and Morrisons and countless others who'd built Tennessee's whiskey heritage through labor and craft. Lucas had grown into leadership of the programs with natural ease, his childhood shaped by watching his father fight and build, having prepared him for the patient work of helping others navigate similar journeys. He understood poverty's grinding reality in ways his college-educated peers didn't, could connect with students facing eviction or food insecurity or the particular shame of needing help because he'd lived those experiences himself. "I remember eating cereal for dinner because that's what we had," he'd told a group of new students during orientation the previous fall. "Remember sleeping in the storage room before Dad could afford to fix the building. Remember being scared we'd lose even this wreck of a place because we couldn't pay property taxes." Those memories don't disappear when circumstances improve. But they can become fuel for understanding what help actually means to people who need it, for recognizing that poverty isn't moral failure and asking for assistance isn't weakness. His honesty about struggle resonated with students in ways that polished professional development couldn't match. Lucas had become the kind of leader who'd been shaped by hardship but not broken by it, who'd learned that vulnerability and strength weren't opposites but complementary aspects of character that mattered. Maya, Sarah's daughter who'd become Daniel's stepdaughter, had taken a different path. She'd studied art history and museum curation, had helped expand the Cooperage's exhibits to include broader context about Tennessee's industrial heritage and the human costs of economic transformation. At 19, she was developing exhibits about Appalachian crafts and the ways traditional skills survived, or didn't, when industries changed and communities adapted. The blended family had its complications, the usual tensions of teenagers navigating combined households and different parenting styles. But they'd also built something that honored both the losses that had shaped them and the choices they'd made to risk connection despite those losses. Sarah's understanding of grief and Daniel's experience with poverty had created a household where struggle was acknowledged rather than hidden, where asking for help was normalized rather than shameful. On a warm evening in late April, 20 years after Daniel had bought the Cooperage for $450, the family gathered for what had become annual tradition. The Brennan Memorial Day, marking the anniversary of William Brennan's death and celebrating the legacy he'd left through protection that had enabled everything that followed. The Cooperage opened to the community, students displayed projects they'd completed, families who'd been helped through programs shared their stories of transformation. Daniel stood at the museum's entrance watching people flow through spaces that had been ruins when he'd first arrived, desperate and scared. The building breathed with purpose now, its brick walls restored, its windows replaced, its floors solid and safe. But more than the physical restoration, the Cooperage carried the weight of stories: William's 80 years of lonely protection, Daniel's desperate purchase and stubborn fight, the thousands of students who'd learned skills and found pathways through programs that whiskey money had funded. Robert Garrett found him there as evening settled, both men older now, shaped by decades that had transformed anger into something approaching understanding. "I brought something you should see," Robert said, handing Daniel a leather folder. Inside were documents from his grandfather's files, correspondence from the 1940s showing the Garrett family's efforts to locate the missing Morrison barrels. "My grandfather died in 1967 still looking for these barrels, still believing they existed somewhere. My father inherited that obsession, spent 50 years trying to acquire any property that might hold them. I inherited the obsession briefly before your purchase forced me to reckon with what family pride had cost across 3 generations." Daniel read the letters showing decades of searching, of pressure applied to anyone who might have information, of the consuming need to claim what the Garretts believed they were owed. This must have been hard to live with. It poisoned 3 generations. Made us believe that acquiring property through patience and pressure proved worth, that adding to family holdings mattered more than how we acquired them or what we did with them once claimed. Robert took the folder back. "Watching what you built with the whiskey money, seeing programs that actually serve people rather than just accumulating assets, it showed me a different model of what legacy could mean. I've been trying to shift our family's business toward that model, with mixed success. It's hard changing direction when you've been moving one way for generations. Yes. But necessary if you don't want to repeat mistakes forever." Robert paused. "I wanted you to know that what you built here matters beyond just this community. It showed me and others that wealth's purpose is what you enable rather than what you possess. That's a lesson my family needed to learn, even if learning came through defeat we spent decades resisting. After Robert left, Daniel walked through the Cooperage alone, tracing the journey that had brought him from eviction notice to this moment of quiet reflection. The building held memories in its walls: Lucas's frightened 7-year-old, the Cellar's discovery, the garret's pressure, the legal fights, Helen's support, Sarah's love, the slow transformation from ruin to purpose. But it also held something more: the accumulated weight of choices made over 20 years, of standing for principles when surrender would have been easier, of using fortune to build rather than simply possess, of learning from William Brennan's mistakes while honoring his dedication to protection that had made everything else possible. Sarah found him in what had been William's apartment, the small rooms now museum space but still carrying the echo of the old man's solitary existence. She'd become expert at reading his moods, understanding when reflection needed companionship and when it required solitude. "You're thinking about the road not taken," she said quietly, settling beside him. "Wondering what would have happened if you'd taken the Garrett's money and walked away." "Sometimes. Though less now than I used to." Daniel looked at exhibits documenting William's life, the photographs showing Cooperage operations, the journals documenting barrel inventory, the final note entrusting everything to whoever bought the property honestly. "I think about Lucas and Maya, about the students we've helped, about what this building means to the community. Then I think about William dying alone protecting barrels nobody knew existed, and I'm grateful we chose different. He protected them so you could build with them. That's not failure on his part, Daniel. That's successful transfer of burden into opportunity." Sarah's understanding of preservation and adaptive reuse extended beyond architecture into human legacy. Buildings and fortunes don't have inherent meaning. They acquire meaning through how they're used, through choices people make about service versus possession. They stood together in silence as darkness settled over the Cooperage, the building solid and purposeful around them, its transformation from abandonment to community asset complete but ongoing. The work would continue, students would learn, exhibits would evolve, programs would adapt to changing community needs. But the foundation was secure, built on whiskey money and stubborn principle and the understanding that legacy mattered most through what you enabled for others. Lucas and Maya joined them as the last visitors left, the four of them walking through the museum, turning off lights, securing doors, completing the small rituals that marked another Brennan Memorial Day. The family that had been cobbled together from loss and desperate choices and the courage to risk connection had become something organic, had proven that inheritance included the families you built as much as the ones you were born into. "Are you glad you bought this place?" Maya asked Daniel as they stood outside looking at the restored Cooperage. She was studying family histories for a museum project, had been asking questions that went beneath surface narratives into emotional truth. Daniel thought about the question, about 20 years compressed into a moment's reflection. "I bought it because I had $450 and nowhere else to go." "So glad isn't quite right. I was desperate, and desperation made me gamble on a property nobody else wanted. But I'm grateful for what that desperation led to, for the chance to build something that matters, for the lessons about standing for things even when standing costs everything you have." The Cooperage sat in darkness now, its museum closed, its workshops silent until morning, its brick walls holding stories that spanned more than a century. William Brennan had built it in 1891, had operated it for decades before closure, had spent 80 years protecting barrels nobody knew existed. Daniel had bought it for his last dollar, had discovered those barrels, had fought to keep them and had used them to build something that honored both the protection and the purpose William had hoped for but never achieved. The land breathed around them, Tennessee soil that had supported Cooperage operations and whiskey production and now supported education and preservation. The forest had reclaimed what had been clearing, nature patient in ways that made human struggles seem brief. But the Cooperage stood as proof that brief struggles mattered, that choices made during desperate times could echo across decades, that legacy was built through standing for things when standing cost everything and through using fortune to serve rather than simply possess. 20 years had transformed Daniel from desperate father facing eviction to man who'd built institution that would outlast him. The journey had required courage he hadn't known he possessed, had tested whether principle mattered more than pragmatism, had forced him to choose repeatedly between surrender and stand when surrender would have been easier and more immediately profitable. But he'd stood, had honored William Brennan's trust, had taught Lucas and Maya through example rather than lecture about what defending things actually required. The Cooperage would continue long after Daniel was gone, would keep teaching and preserving, would remain monument to the idea that desperate gambles sometimes led to places that honored both the desperation and the courage it took to try. As they walked to the car, Lucas carrying the banner that would be stored until next year's memorial, Daniel felt the weight of 20 years settle into something approaching completion. Not ending, because the work would continue and Lucas would carry it forward. But closure on the journey that had started with eviction notice and $450, that had led through Cellar discovery and legal battles and slow understanding that wealth mattered through what you built rather than what you accumulated. The Cooperage stood behind them, solid and purposeful under stars that had looked down on this land before anyone had built barrel-making facilities or hidden whiskey or fought legal battles over ownership. The stars would continue after everyone currently alive was gone, witnessing the patient work of fortunes being found and buildings being restored and families choosing to serve rather than simply possess. William Brennan had died alone protecting barrels, had spent 80 years maintaining promises father had made to people who died before that promise could be fulfilled. Daniel had found those barrels and had learned from William's lonely dedication, had understood that protection mattered but connection mattered more, that building things required also building relationships, that the fullest legacy included showing those who came after that courage meant both standing for principles and opening yourself to love when love required vulnerability you'd learn to avoid. The land had given Daniel more than security or wealth. It had given him purpose, family, the ability to help others facing circumstances he remembered with visceral clarity. But it had also taught him that the hardest courage was choosing not to repeat previous generations' mistakes, was learning when to fight and when to yield, when to protect and when to share, when to stand alone and when to build the connections that made standing possible. The Cooperage sat in peaceful darkness, its restoration complete, its programs thriving, its legacy secured through choices that had honored both William Brennan's protection and the understanding that protection without purpose was its own form of poverty. And Daniel drove home with his family, grateful for desperate choices and whiskey barrels and the slow transformation of ruin into community asset that had taught him more about courage and legacy than any careful planning could have provided. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.